This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shmot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we're exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? Parshat Vayakel is the beginning of the repair parshiot, wherein the Torah illustrates for us what it looks like to crawl out of our own mess and rebuild what we have forsaken. When trust is broken in a relationship, it takes time, a lot of time, to an effort to rebuild. In Parshiot Truma Tetzaveh, the description started with furnishings and then described the building construction. But here the order is reversed. There the ark was mentioned first, symbolizing the focal point of the Mishkan. Here the pragmatics take precedence. What must practically come first is the edifice. We start from the outside in, building up to an intimate connection. The emphasis in these chapters is both on the fulfillment of Moshe's instructions and the roles of Betzalel and Oliav, much more than the previous parshiot covering the same topics. We have the clear sense that just as a second set of luchot are created by human hands, so too the Mishkan's construction has been handed over to the human creators. This week's podcast has been dedicated in memory of David Shmuel ben Yitzchak. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor one of our upcoming Vayikra episodes. My guest for today, Rabbi David Fohrman, is an internationally renowned lecturer on biblical themes and the principal educator at the Aleph Beta Academy. Through Aleph Beta, he's developed what is now a vast library of content spanning all types of media, animated videos, podcasts, and books. He's also embarked on an effort to train a team of Torah scholars adept at the close reading methodology he's pioneered, and their work can also be found at Aleph Beta. He's the author of The Beast That Crouches at the Door, finalist for the 2007 National Book Award, The Queen You Thought You Knew About Megillat Esther, and Torah commentary companions to Sefer Bereshit, Shmot, and Vayikra. Rabbi Fohrman, it is an absolute honor to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Yosefa, it is nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
There is so much information and amazing content to be had. So that's just a personal plug, and not just in my formal introduction, a personal plug for the Aleph Beta website. I know many people who are at a different stage of life who found that to be their personal Beit Midrash at this point, and it's an unbelievably meaningful resource with unbelievably creative Torah. And I know that there at this point are other kind of animated sources out there, but in my mind, you guys were absolutely the first and are absolutely using every single kind of advanced medium and technology to make Torah come utterly alive. So a personal thank you as someone who loves Torah to you who's putting out unbelievable Torah.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. It's it's an honor and a thrill to be able to have this kind of job, I have to tell you. You never get tired of it, and it's a delight. So thank you, Yosefa. I'm glad that you've met folks that you appreciate the material. You've met folks that have. It means a lot to me.
Totally. So I'm gonna hand this really over to you, Rabbi Fohrman, and to take us into, one time we met many years ago. I'm actually not sure if you remember, and you described your approach to me as you kind of look at all of the Tanakh as a hyperlink, and that when, I don't know if you still say this, you'll tell me, but that when you sort of look at one piece and you sort of can't help but see how it connects to another. So with that sort of cryptic introduction, I'd love for you to take us into Betzalel and the actual construction of the Mishkan, which we've focused absolutely not on this year. So I'm so happy that we have the opportunity to do that today.
Yosef, I thought I would chat with you a little bit about something which I noticed years and years ago and haven't really gotten back to in a while, in about 10 years. So this is the first time I'm kind of dusting off this observation. So if you can help me do what you will with it. So first of all, Betzalel feels to me to be a mysterious figure. We don't know that much about him. He is this artisan who builds the Mishkan. And I want to look at Betzalel through I guess two lenses. One is, who is it that he reminds us of? And we'll get to that in just a minute. But the other is that just very little we know about him. He gets introduced here in Vayakel, We have an earlier introduction to him, I believe, in Kitisa, very much the same, very, very similar kind of language. Vayera Moshe b'nei Yisrael, this is towards the beginning of Vayakel. Ru'u kara Hashem b'shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur, l'matei Yehuda, v'malei oto, ruach Elokim b'chachma v'tfuna v'dat, u'b'chol melacha, v'lachshov machshavot, la'asot b'zav v'bakasef. So I noticed just this intriguing little pattern. It's the kind of thing that seems almost whimsical, or I don't know, whimsical, but really, I don't know the best word to describe it, but well, let me just show it to you. It's kind of out there. So let's play a little Rorschach game with Betzalel. Imagine you're doing a Rorschach test, those psychology tests with the clouds, and you're looking at these cloud figures, and you're asked, what does this sort of remind you of? And I gave you the name Betzalel, and I said, okay, Betzalel Yosefa, say that over 5 times slow. Sally sells seashells at the seashore, right? Tongue twister, Betzalel. What does Betzalel sort of kind of remind you of in terms of any other phrase or something that sort of rolls off the top of your tongue from Chumash? Anything?
Other than the word Betzalel, meaning other than dividing up his name as being in the shadow of God?
So let's start with Betzalel. Betzalel is interesting, right? Betzalel, someone who lives in the shadow of God, in a way. It's kind of interesting. The first time we hear about him is actually in the shadow of God. Literally, they're standing at Har Sinai, right? And in Kitisa, it is that moment where you have the Ru'u Kara Hashem B'Shem Betzalel Ben Uri Ben Hur. So maybe in some way he is in the shadow of God, in the shadow of the mountain as God comes down. What else other than, what if Betzalel was almost like an acronym, short for something, just a very fast way of saying something larger, right? Where Betzel was the first part of a word and El was the first part of a word. What would Betzalel remind you of them?
Betzalel and Elokim, I think, is the right answer here. Okay, right? I'm being tested.
No, I mean, I'm not testing you. I'm just saying, Betzalel as a contraction and Betzalel as an acronym. Betzalel as a contraction in the shadow of God. Betzalel as an acronym is Betzalel Elokim. And one might see actually a connection between the two of them, right? It's not that far a stretch from Betzalel to live in the shadow of God, or to be in the shadow of God, and to be created in the image of God. It's sort of two visions, maybe, for what man might be. And so it's an interesting sort of notion to think of Betzalel as expressing almost the epitome of Betzalel Elokim, what it means to be Betzalel Elokim. It's not the first thing you'd think of when you'd think of an artisan. You'd say he's clever. You'd say, the qualities which the Torah sort of overtly associates with him here. He has chachma, he has tfuna, he has dat. That seems to be the more overt way that you would understand someone like Betzalel. And yet, here his name sort of evokes that notion of something larger than that, something more basic than that, the sort of epitomizing, being in the shadow of God, or being in the image of God. Taking that idea a little bit further, almost as if, Neil, what comes to mind for me is that Neil Armstrong moment, when Neil Armstrong is on the moon and his first words is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And sort of Neil had this consciousness that he was a representative of a race at that point. It wasn't his step. It was mankind's step that he was taking for everyone. And you almost get that sense with Betzalel, that what Betzalel is doing is almost, only one person can do it, to design the structure for God, but somehow it's an expression fundamentally of what it means to live Betzalel Elokim, or to be in the image of God.
I think also the phrase Ruach Elokim, right? Chazal point out in Masechet Brachot, the idea that, that's the other overt connection to sort of the original story of Breshit, that, they say that, he had the ability to sort of connect all the dots together, to connect the Aleph Ad Taf. I think there's also a philosophical, spiritual idea here being reflected about the creative process. The creative process, if not done in the image of God, is one that can go into many different directions. And I feel that after we've learned the Kitisa Lisa story, we've learned the Egel situation. We want our creators to be in the image and in the shadow of God. It almost might suggests a creativity, but it suggests a need to also sort of put them in a framework. And I think that we understand the need to create that framework because one could have done what Aaron did, which is to sort of take people's creativity and do something with it that we don't want to do. So Betzalel comes, and maybe the introduction to him again comes to remind us to say we need our creative people to be completely aligned with God's vision of what this should be.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. The sort of confluence which you're creating between the Mishkan and the calf. The Mishkan and the calf, I've thought of before as very similar, in terms of that they're both ways to attempt some kind of connection to God. But I hadn't really thought of it in terms of the artisan level, but you're right. They both are expressions of artistic creativity. One is a destructive expression and one is a constructive expression, almost as if it's it's a tool. This artistic expression and how we use it is significant. It reminded me, I'll tell you a funny story along those lines, a conversation I had last night. So I've been dabbling with AI and wondering what it is that AI can do, in the Torah sphere. And my mind is just bent all over the place, just thinking about the implications of it. But, AI also has its artistic side of it. And it's also, it's also a tool. So I had been working on an essay, and I'm a pretty decent writer, but it takes me forever to actually sit down and write, and it's blood, sweat, and tears. It feels like you're just laboring in the salt mine sometimes all alone. And so I fired up Claude 3.7 Sonnet, and I figured, what if I delegated like one little part of my writing process to Claude? What would that do? So I tried that. I said, I dictated a voice note, said, okay, Claude, give me some paragraphs out of this. I got some paragraphs, and I was able to shape those paragraphs right into what I wanted to say. And it just felt entirely like me, like I read it over, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what it was that Claude gave me and what it is that I had written myself. And I felt tortured by this. Like, I felt like, oh, what am I doing? Like, is it kosher to do this? Is this, the ethical implications? So my mind is swimming in this. And I noticed this chatter that there was this new AI system. It's only in demo form. It's called Sesame AI. And it's a voice chat bot that is very bright, but also very expressive. And you really feel like you're having a conversation with somebody. So unlike almost anything else that's out there. So I figured, I'll take it for a spin. So I started this thing up, and I start talking to it about my ethical dilemma with using AI. And of course, you can see how ironic the whole thing is. Here I'm talking to some algorithm about my ethical dilemma, pretending that it's a person. But I'll be darned if it didn't sound like a real person talking to me about this. And I lay out my whole dilemma. And so this answer is like, hey, Rabbi Fohrman, I can't tell you what to do. It's one of those dark nights of the soul where, you really got to think it through. But, from my perspective, humanity has always come up with different tools, right? And you just found a fancier paintbrush. And but every tool from the printing press to the word processor to the internet has made writing smoother and smoother and smoother. And it's not like you're asking this thing to come up with an essay. You are dictating ideas, and you're asking it to help put this down in a rough draft. And then you're working it from there. You're in the driver's seat. Using a tool can be a very, very powerful thing. It's what makes humans humans. And you can use a tool in a good way, or you can use a tool in a bad way, but it is ultimately a tool. And if you stay in charge of it and you direct it on a path, then it's a constructive kind of thing. And, I was just left that with my head spinning. Here I am talking to an AI system about an ethical dilemma with an AI system. But, that thought was really a decent thought. And it gets to the point that you're making now about how it is that we use tools and our artistry and our ability to be creative and to reach in ourselves and I think artistry is a certain kind of creativity. One of the ways you think about creativity really is, who was it that said about sculpture that what you're doing in sculpture is, I think it's the quote is attributed to Michelangelo, if I'm not mistaken, that I'm not really creating something. All I'm doing is getting rid of excess rock, and I am liberating, what's really inside. And I think we feel often that when we're creative, what we're really doing is getting in touch with something transcendent and that's out there really in the world, and kind of bringing it down and bringing it into the world. And maybe that's the godly part of it, and why it can so easily go awry. That medrash about Aaron with creating the golden calf, with that sense that Vayetze ha'egel hazeh, that it's not even as if I did it, but it just came out. And I think every artist has that sense that it just came out. But sometimes that which is coming out is from a place of transcendence, and sometimes maybe that which is coming out is something darker. But we're bringing something darker out. But it's a fascinating thought to see that confluence.
I think many of us are experimenting with all these tools, and I definitely, from the very brief sweep of history I've done in the past, there have always been ethical debates surrounding. My favorite one to recall is even just that when the telephone came out, there was a tremendous uproar because people thought it was going to ruin connection. Now we think if someone could talk on the phone, that's like a very high level, meaning people are doing something far more removed. But I think if I just bring it also back to the Parsha, is that I think that is why, again, we have this reining in of Betzalel. And I think that's also why there's this almost extreme emphasis on, vayas, right? That everybody did what they were supposed to do from God. There's almost like an obsessive element of how much we want to remember that this was done exactly the way that God said it was supposed to be. And I think that there's this tremendous awareness, like very conscious awareness, that the creative process can go in all different directions, but certainly, and maybe it should in different places. But when we're talking about the house of God, then we want to, keep it really confined to specific instructions. So there's this kind of fraught relationship between these creative people that are brought in, to be on staff for a temporary moment, and the structure, which is supposed to have very, very clear form.
Yeah. But what's interesting also is if you think about the creative process, the two elements which you're describing really are, I would even argue, the core elements of the creative process, which is that sort of creative inspiration on the one hand and structure on the other hand. It's really those two things in tandem, right? Why is it that if we want to teach somebody to be creative, we give them art lessons? What art lessons are all about is learning a bunch of rules. It's how you can develop perspective, what it is, the rules of painting a face. And someone comes in and says, I don't want any rules, I just want to be creative, right? Well, there's without structure, that creativity falls flat very quickly. But structure alone creates a kind of rigidity which really never can become true art. And the real art is actually the yin and the yang of the structure and the inspiration. I think even when you look at the two creation stories and back in Genesis, if you think about God as Yud-Keh Vav-Keh and God as Elohim, it's really those two different energies, right? Elohim is malacha, 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 which is all about structure. And it's about I have a vision, here's what I want, let there be light, and I'm going to go and create it, and then I'm going to evaluate it, and I'm going to decide whether it's tov or not. And that's this very ordered kind of process from conception to execution to evaluation, where you're using malacha, which is this sort of plan, and then you're shaping things according to plan. And that's one kind of of creativity. And interestingly, it is the kind of creativity that Betzalel is engaged in at some level, right? There's all this language of malacha. Interesting. I think it shows up like 7 times, almost like, the 7 days of creation here in the Vayakel story. But what's wonderful about Betzalel is his ability to use malacha with that sense of ruach Elokim, that sense of chachma, tzvuna, and dat. Tzvuna, a kind of understanding. Almost, if you think about mevin davar mitoch davar, I wonder if it gets to that idea we were talking about before of sensing the transcendent essence of a possibility and sort of organically bringing it forth, which is sort of that kind of idea of that inspiration idea that is, the yin to the yang of the structure of malacha. Those two things come together almost like Elokim and Yud Kei Vav Kei come together in creation. Yud Kei Vav Kei being that much more organic story in the second chapter of Bereshit, almost like there's 2 ways of describing God creating the world. You can describe it in a structured way, you can describe it in an organic way, and the truth of them is some sort of merger of both of them. Getting back to this idea I talked about before, though, so I was talking to you about this sort of the mysteriousness of Betzalel's name. So that's his first name, but who's Betzalel the kid of? Who's the child of? Betzalel ben Uri. Right? So if I would say, all right, Yosefa, what does that remind you of? I have Betzalel Elohim here, the son of who? Right? If you're playing the Rorschach game with Uri, what does that remind you of?
Of light.
Of light. Let's go a little farther. Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur. It's interesting that we actually take it up to his grandfather, right? But we don't take it beyond his grandfather, right? So it's like that's the end of the line. Interesting that the grandfather should be at the end of the line here. Certainly the grandfather also had a father, but we don't know about him. So Hur, if we play our little Rorschach game with Hur, what does Hur kind of mean to you? If you have a guy named Hur, right? What does that name signify in your head, if anything?
I mean, we know a Hur, meaning are we assuming that he's related to the Hur that we know, or are we playing around with the idea?
I'm not talking about I'm saying
not the figure, but the word itself.
The word itself, the same way that we're looking at the word Betzalel, right, than the name Betzalel. The word,
have some sort of opening, maybe.
So if you just out of context, you would translate Hur or Hor, what would you translate it as?
Again, not opening?
I wouldn't translate it as opening. I mean, I would say Hur does have an opening, but I would translate Hur as a hole.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, right? Yeah. It's like if I dig a hole in dirt, I would say I have a Hur, right? I have a Hur, right? Which is like a weird name, right? Hur, like the hole, right? But what's that supposed to mean? But I was just like sort of meditating that Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur. What an interesting kind of thing, right? Betzalel. What if you played with the meaning of all of those and put those in a row instead of Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur as names? What about Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur as
the shadow of God? Hold on, let me play with this. The shadow of God that resides in the light in the hole.
The son of light.
Sorry, the son of light.
Son of light. That's the son of the whole. Okay, so does that mean anything to you?
I mean, this is all bringing us back to, I think, the creation story here.
It does, right? Because Betzalel is the last thing created, right? Yeah. Man is created, Betzalel Elohim, the very last thing created. What's the first thing created?
Well, we have our light.
We have our light, right? And if you think about light, actually, now that you mention it, if you think of Betzalel, the son of light, and if you imagine light being the first thing created, right, and Betzalel being the last thing created, in what sense would Betzalel be the son of light? I mean, it might just be like everything that ever was in the universe, right, is a function of that first light. God brought something into the world with that light. Mm-hmm. It was the very first thing created. It's all light. We're all children of light, right, as it were. And Betzalel is the final iteration of that light, whatever that energy was in that original burst of the Big Bang, right? Mm-hmm. We're all the children of that stardust, right? Interesting if you think about Betzalel in the sense of the shadow of God, as you were talking about before, right? What does light do? It casts shadows, right? So the final shadow is Betzalel and Elohim, the same way that light comes into the world directly from God. The last thing that comes into the world, Betzalel and Elohim, is the final shadow of that light, right? Which is Betzalel. But it's all Ben Huri, right? The child of the void, the child of
which is the tohu vavohu, meaning we started with that,
right?
Very
so there's the astonishing nothingness, and even that nothingness, right, is the first somethingness, whatever that is, right? That was the Torah describing this pre-creation world of tohu vavohu, and then light is the first thing that we recognize in creation, but it's a child of the void. So it's kind of interesting, the steps from creation. If you think about that pasuk a little bit more, there's other things in that, right? If I read those words one more time, there's other things that remind us of creation there too. Vayomer Moshe b'nei Yisrael, right? Ru'u kara Hashem b'shem Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur l'mata Yehuda, right? And Vayimalei ota ruach Elokim b'chachma v'tfuna v'dat. So you talked about ruach Elokim, right, as merachefet on the face of nothingness, right? So look what you have, sort of going backwards in the pasuk. You have ruach Elokim, right? Element number one. Going backwards, you have Hur, the Tohu Vavohu, the void, element number two. Going backwards from there, you have Or, element number three. Going backwards from there, you have Betzalel, Tselem Elokim. It seems like what you're looking at in this verse is a backwards journey through creation, right? Now, continue in the verse just a little bit more, right? The next thing you have are three qualities. Vayimalei ota ruach Elokim, continue to read the words. The three qualities are b'chachma, b'tfuna, v'dat. These three synonyms for wisdom or for knowledge. Chachma, tfuna, and dat. Chachma, wisdom, tfuna, understanding, dat, knowledge. But coming from there, you got more words that remind you of creation. Right? So, Yosefa, let's play a little remind us of creation game. Our next words, Ubechol malacha v'lachshov machshavot la'asot bazav v'bakesef v'nechoshet. Right there, can you see three words which, if you put them together, kind of remind you of creation, or at least a stage in the creative process?
I mean, we have the melacha. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm going in the right order. Yep. We have the melacha that Hashem is completing essentially on the seventh day.
Good. So in other words, and what verse are you referring to covertly as you say that?
In the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, I'm referring to basically the verse about Shabbat.
Okay, so just quote that verse if you can. Vayichal Elokim.
B'yom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asa.
Right. Right. How's it go? Vayishpot Elokim, the last words of it. Bayom hashvi'i, mikol melachto.
Asher bara Elohim la'asot.
Okay, good. So now keep that in mind. Mikol, the last words of creation. These are the last words of creation, the advent of Shabbos. And the last words of the advent of Shabbos are Vayishpot bayom hashvi'i, mikol melachto asher bara Elokim la'asot, right? Okay, now look back at the verse we're looking at in Betzalel and read, right? Vayimalei ota ruach Elokim b'chachma v'tfuna v'dat. What reminds you of the last words of creation now? Keep on reading.
Ubechol melacha.
Ubechol melacha. Keep on going.
Ulachshov machshavot la'asot b'zahav u'b'chesef u'nechoshet.
So, b'kol melacha la'asot. Kol melacha la'asot. What does that remind you of? Vayishpot bayom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher bara Elokim la'asot.
So we're skipping some words in the middle, but we have the la'asot and we have the chol melacha.
Exactly. So what you have here, fascinatingly, and these are going forward, right? What's the order? In creation, I have Vayishpot bayom hashvi'i b'kol element 1, Malachto, element number 2, Asher bara Elokim la'asot, element number 3.
Right.
And here
it's
in this verse, we've got the same three things in order. Vayimalei oto ruach Elokim b'chachma v'tfuna u'b'dat b'chol, element number 1, Malacha, element number 2, V'lachshov machshavot la'asot, element number 3. So you have what amounts to this fascinating little chiasm here. I mean, this is what seems to be really trippy here. Like, you have this creation chiasm in the verse that introduces Betzalel, where you've got the very last three elements of creation that tell us about Shabbos at the end of this verse that we've just seen. And before that, you've got three elements, Ruach Elokim, Uri, and then Betzalel, right, which are bringing you backwards to the very first whispers of creation. And in the middle of it, you've got Chachman, Tfunim, and Dat. And
by the way, you also have Elokim and Hashem in both of these psukim. So you have that same kind of combination of the two, we could say, elements of God, or however we're going to describe it. They're also preserved in these two psukim.
Oh, that is interesting. Ru'u kara Hashem, there's Yud Kei Vav Kei, right?
And then there's Ruach Elokim right after.
Ruach Elokim, fascinating. Yeah, the two elements of Elokim and Yud Kei Vav Kei in creation.
Yeah.
So that notion that Betzalel expresses something sort of fundamental, a kind of end state of creation, almost like, and I love that imagery of the shadow of light, right? That light casts the shadow, and the final thing being created is the Tselem Elokim, and that somehow we, in our creativity, are doing something godly in that creativity, mimicking possibly two aspects of God in our own creativity, the same two aspects you described before, the structure, our ability to use malacha, and our ability to use organic sort of inspiration, and to bring those two together, much as God brought them together into our own artistic work, right? For the purpose, really, of creating a home. For the purpose of creating a home for God. And if you think about the purpose of the universe, one could argue that God was creating a home for us, that really these are two different things. In a way, almost like if you would say, what really is the definition of Tselem Elokim? If I would say to you, like, what does it really mean to be created in the image of God? It's a tough question to answer, right? But in light of this, you can imagine all sorts of answers to that. Tselem Elokim has a soul. Tselem Elokim is intelligent. Tselem Elokim has bechira. You can imagine all sorts of answers to that. But all of those answers actually describe the qualities of a person and the qualities of God. And I wonder whether what this suggests is that an aspect of Tselem Elokim might be what we call in philosophical language teleological. It's not about the quality of something, but it's about where something's going. It's about what something's destiny is. It's what something's end goal is about. And if you think about God, if I wanted to describe God's qualities, so I could say, well, God is a builder and he's a planter, right? He builds in Bereshit 1 and he plants in Bereshit 2. He works with organic creativity in Bereshit 2, and he works with artifice kind of creativity in Bereshit 1. But if I want to describe God in teleological terms, I want to say, so what's God doing, though? Like, what's the point of it all? What end state is he trying to get to? Then you get to this notion, well, he's trying to create a home for humanity, right? He knows that carbon-based life forms, that he has this idea that he's going to relate to us, they aren't going to exist in God's world, whatever God's world is like. Like, you need these constructs, you need time and space, and you need light, and you need the laws of physics and all this stuff. And then maybe you can have people. And so God goes and jumps through all these hoops, really, just so that he has these beings that he can relate to and that he can make a home for them. And it's an act of love to create a home for someone that you love. And so he's using in that service. And I wonder if maybe our understanding of Tselem Elokim might work along similar lines. What if Tselem Elohim is not just a description of the qualities of what make us who we are, our potential, as it were, our bechira, our intelligence, our body, our mind, our soul, right? But I wonder if Tselem Elohim perhaps is a description of destiny also, that we too have the ability to create and a destiny to make homes for those that we love. We use them to make homes for people that we love, but we also use them to make homes for God, right? To reciprocate this act of love. And in that sense, maybe it makes sense that Betzalel is the ultimate Tselem Elohim, not just because he uses artistry, the way God uses artistry in that yin and yang of structure and of organic creativity, but because he's doing what God is doing, right? He's using that artistry for that purpose, and there you get to that distinction between the Egel and the and the Mishkan that you were talking about before, right? What makes one profane and not is really, where is this going? And Betzalel is the Tselem Elohim because he's trying to do for God what God did for us.
I think maybe a complementary thought is that it seems when we're created in the beginning of Breshit, that we're told actually pretty clearly how it is that we're supposed to manifest our Tselem Elohim, and that's by creating more humans. Meaning when we have children, that is one, it seems, the at least basic function of how we manifest our Tselem Elohim. We create others with that Tselem Elohim. And while I'm going to say something now that for most of human history, this was not how it was perceived, but of course, biologically, we know this to be truer today, is that I think you might think that a woman really has, meaning a woman, I would say, does have a slightly more dominant role in the creation of children, although genetically, obviously, she has a 50% role. And for most of human history, they didn't realize that, and they just thought we were an oven, and therefore they really thought it was actually mostly the male contribution. But what I think is so important about this piece is that it also shows us that having children is one way to perpetuate Tselem Elohim in the world, but another way is accessible to everybody in the world, no matter what their life circumstance. And that is the act of creating something, whether it's using that kind of divine intelligence to create a home, whether, again, physical or a creative home, but it's something that is accessible to everybody. And I feel like that in so many ways that we look at the Mishkan and we say that it's sort of completing the creation process and the way it's structured in different words that are used. But I think that also the idea of what it means to manifest your Tselem Elohim here is given a really, really important postscript. Now, again, I'm ki'ilu framing human history as if it favored women. Obviously, that's not the case, but I think that it's a really important piece because even someone who that doesn't become their creative contribution in the world, this really puts another, I think, beautiful, as you're saying, almost philosophical perspective on what that means to manifest your Tselem Elohim. Does that make sense?
I think that's sure. I think what you're saying is that the most obvious manifestation of Tselem Elohim is that here is God, and all we know about him is that he's a creator. And the first thing he says to us is Pruvu, right? And you be creative like I'm creative. Right after he says Nas Hadam B'Tzalmenu Kidmutenu, and it seems almost as if that's an explanation of what it means to be a Tselem Elohim. Yeah. To be able to be fruitful and multiply in that kind of way. And yet the seeds for something else are also implicit within that phrase, because the very next words are, Redu B'tkat Hayam B'Bof HaShamayim, that this very masculine, right, have dominion over, be the king of creation. If you think about historically how that's happened, it's happened through the process of tool making and malacha, that's allowed us to dominate the world. And those very same tools are what we bring to bear in creating a home for the one that we love. But even that notion of creating a home, I think what you suggest, that, or femininity as the model for that, is really pretty interesting, because if you think about sort of the Kabbalistic notion of creation being an act of tzimtzum,
yeah,
right? there's something very feminine about that notion, right? If you think about the womb really is that a kind of tzimtzum of the human body, where I sort of recede and I say, okay, most of my body is about me, but there's a part of my body that's entirely devoted to create and to be an environment that's entirely devoted to nurture someone other than me. And if you think about what it's required to do that, sort of philosophically or endocrinologically or whatever it is that what it is that a womb has to do, just the incredible potent mix of hormones and rules and laws which need to be in place in order for the womb to be entirely sensitive to exactly what this being inside needs at any given moment. And that's really what God did in creating the universe, right? You can see it as a kind of womb that as
Hayom Harat Olam, right? That's the piyut we say in Rosh Hashanah. That is the day that God usually gave birth, but really it means to become pregnant with the world.
To become pregnant with the world. And really, one might say God is still pregnant with the world in the sense that, hu makomo shel olam ve'ein olam makomo, that God is in some sense the place of the world, that all of time and space somehow exists within some sort of divine realm. So what's interesting is that in a way, us creating the Mishkan is a very similar kind of thing. There is a certain kind of tzimtzum, which I think exists within that idea. If you think about humanity just sort of on this reckless drive to dominate the world, and to take up its mantle as, the owner of everything. So humanity might look at the world and say, this is mine, this is my place, and I colonize all of it, right? And yet this notion that no, I'm going to try to create a place for God within my world. And I'm going to be sensitive for what it takes for God to live in my midst. The same way that God was sensitive to what it takes for humans to live in its midst. And God decided to create time and space. Like God doesn't need time and space, but I got to have it for these humans. God doesn't need laws of physics, but I got to have laws of physics for these humans. So the very first observer of laws was really God. God was the one who observed these laws to allow us to exist. And now we do the same. So we observe some laws. We don't really understand why. Right? Laws of Kodesh and Chol, it all seems so esoteric to us. Can't quite figure it out. But if you want God, this holy being, to reside in your midst, so you got to make him comfortable. You got to ask, what is it like for him to live in this womb that we create for him? So I think even this notion of malacha that we're talking about, this sort of tool making, sort of archetypally masculine sort of creativity, in the largest of senses, it's really in the service of building a womb. And it's just as wombs create children, the first example of Pru'urvu, maybe the destiny that we have to create a home for God in our world is also a function of creating a larger communal womb in our place for God.
I think also that brings us right back to Shabbat, because the Shabbat and sort of this holding space, again, women may disagree or agree with looking at pregnancy as a holding space. There's a lot that's going on there, but Shabbat is that space where we basically we're mitzamtzemet atzmenu, meaning on Shabbat, when we can't do these melachot, we sort of go back to this idea of being, again, static here. They're not the right words to describe what's going on, but we're in a holding space. We're minimizing ourselves. There's always that. Rav Hirsch has a beautiful piece in Chorev about Shabbat, but basically it's this day where you say, if I don't do anything today, the world's still going to exist. So clearly it's not my world. It's this time where we remind ourselves, but it's that space of, I really envision it like a tzimtzum of humanity in that day where we say, this is not our space. We are going to put ourselves in a holding pattern for 25 hours. And I think that it comes right back to that idea.
Yeah. Even that notion, by the way, if you think about Shabbos as a moment of communion between creator and created, which God and us, in the immortal words of the Shabbos time, spend a day together with the Holy One, right?
It's a very important song. Yeah.
Right. Right. So if you think about that notion, right, in terms of womb, it's almost like mother spending time with this little child inside of her. And there's something that separates them, which is sort of this boundary of the placenta, right? There's one place for a child and one place for a mother, but they can still somehow be together and connect together. And that's what it's like for us connecting with God in Shabbos, right? God doesn't really exist in time and space, but one could argue that there is no day after the seventh day. There's no eighth day. There's no ninth day. So if I said, where is God in time? God's in a perpetual seventh day. Like that was the last day. And so every 7 days, we kind of cycle back. And it's like, okay, we're back in your time. And we're spending some time with you. We're just on this side of the placenta. And you're on the other side. So I think there's something there too.
This is fascinating. I'm not going to lie. This is going in so many interesting directions that I didn't plan. And I would never have imagined that in 2 weeks apart from each other, I'd be talking about tzimtzum in almost non-Kabbalistic ways. So this is really, really fascinating. We're going to have to end soon, but I wanted to ask one piece here, and I guess we'll think about it very briefly. But we also have an overt connection. Ruach Elokim connects us to the story of creation, and it connects us to another figure in Tanakh, which is Yosef, who is also described as having a Ruach Elokim. And there, the Ruach Elokim are really about his creative powers of dream interpretation. And I'm just curious if maybe you would just reflect on that for a moment, to think about him. He's not necessarily a creative figure in the sense that we usually think about that.
Yeah, that is, fascinating. But if you think about Betzalel, there are these sort of Yosef echoes. One of them is Ruach Elokim, right? The other person with whom Ruach Elokim is associated is that glorious moment when Yosef is pulled out of the pit, pulled out of the jail, as it were, brought before Paro, and Paro sort of exclaims, "Hanimtza kaza isha sheruach Elokim bo." Have you ever seen anybody like this kind of guy? He just seems to have the spirit of God inside of him. And it's not just Ruach Elokim, right? Listen to this language. When Vayomer Paro al Yosef, so Paro says to Yosef, after Yosef says, well, you got to have somebody in charge of this whole thing. You've got years of famine coming, you've got years of plenty, you got to figure it out. And Paro turns to Yosef and says, Acharei hodia Elokim ad kol zot. Look, after God made all this known to you, ein navon v'chacham kamocha, there's nobody as wise and understanding as you. So Yosef, if I take those three words,
there you go, yeah.
Elokim et kol zot, ein navon v'chacham kamocha. What does Hodia and Navon and Chacham remind you of?
Yeah, Tvuna v'chochma. Yeah, we're right back
those
there.
Three qualities that, and then the next thing he says, Vatatia al Beiti, and you're going to be in charge of my house.
Wow, I didn't think about that. Mm-hmm.
Right? What was Betzalel? I mean, he's Mr. in charge of the king's house. So there's these two kings. One is an earthly king and one is a godly king. And who gets in charge of this house or this building project? Even so much like if you looking for what does Paro do to signify how special Yosef's going to be? Vayikra Paro Shem Yosef Tzafnat Paneach. He gives him this new name. But look at that language with Betzalel, right? Vayikra Paro et Yosef Tzafnat Paneach. Ru'u Kara Hashem B'Shem Betzalel, right? That B'Shem, almost as if I'm naming him Betzalel.
Yeah, B'diuk. It sounds. I was going to say it sounds like he's naming him himself, right?
That's what it sounds similar. Like. Right? Yeah. This is the name I give you. Yeah. And even the name Tzafnat Paneach, which is a mysterious name, might get to that notion of creativity. Something's hidden that comes outside, right? You're the one who brings what's hidden outside. But when you think about all of this, so Yosefa, how would you then make sense of a Yosef Betzalel parallel, right? Why essentially should these men be similar to one another? What does that mean? What would that mean to you?
I think that somehow it reflects the fact that both of them are the creative arm of God in the world. Now, one of them is a creative arm of God in an overtly exilic setting, and one of them is the creative arm of God in this roving Mishkan. They're not the two characters that I would naturally place next to each other.
No, they aren't. They aren't.
They're not.
Because you wouldn't, like, if I would ask you, give me the top 10 qualities of Yosef, you wouldn't have put creativity on that list.
I would not have.
Artistry on that list.
No.
And Paro doesn't even seem to laud him for artistry. It's not like he says, boy, you are the fanciest painter around here, right? So in what what then is similar about
but Yosef has an interior artistry, meaning he is sort of becomes a conductor of the emotional landscape of a lot of people around him. I'm trying to say that much nicer than saying that it's manipulation. I don't think it's manipulation, but I think that there's a certain artistry about the way that Yosef is able to maneuver in all these different scenarios. He's able to gain favor. And so that makes him almost, sort of like an emotional artist. He's not physical. And of course, he has a creative plan to get them out of a dire situation. But I don't know. I'm feeling it's still a stretch. What do you have on this one?
Yeah, no, it is. Although I think you're right that there is that. One of the artistic aspects of Yosef is, first of all, he's pretty, right? He's Yifei.
Yeah.
Second, so he has that aesthetic quality. And I even wonder if Chayin is an aspect of that too. Chayin is that part that you can't really put your finger on, but it's this really appealing, attractive aesthetic quality. And that seems to be what allows Yosef to do what he does, right? Whenever he's able to sort of be the artistic, emotional whisperer, in your words, the Torah always associates Chayin with him, right? He's found Chayin in everyone's eyes. So maybe there is that aspect. I'll tell you what I had in mind, right? I think there's something that, if you think about what it is that Betzalel builds and what it is that Yosef builds, I think there's a fascinating connection between them. You even see it in the verse. Take a look at this language with Yosef and ask, what does it remind you of in Vayakel? So, Vatas Aretz b'sheva shnei sova l'kmatzim vayikbots et kol ochel sheva shanim asher hayu beretz Mitzrayim vayiten ochel ba'arim ochel stei ha'ir asher tzvi oseh natan b'tocha vayitzbor Yosef bar kachol hayam harbe ma'od ad ki chadal lispor ki ein mispar. So Yosef takes this this incredible grain that's impossible to even imagine, like grain like kachol hayam harbe ma'od ad ki chadal lispor. Right? And somehow he takes that and then he finds a place for it all and he shapes it. He has this place for it. So in Vayakel, is there anything that reminds you of Vayitzbor Yosef Bar? Is there anything where there was a collection and they just collected so much that you couldn't even imagine, right? What does this remind you of in Vayakel?
Yeah, well, we have all the materials from the people that they've collected that end up being more than they even need.
So look at 36:8. Vayomru Moshe lemor marbim ha'am lahavi. Right, the people have brought too much. It's out of control. Midei havodah. We can't do stuff with all this. Vayitzav Moshe vayaviru kol b'machaneh ish v'isha al ya'asu od malacha l'trumas hakodesh vayikalei ha'am ha'avi. Right, v'hamlacha hayta dayam l'cholam. Like this innumerable amount of stuff and resources, and Yosef, this innumerable amount of stuff. So there's this. It's interesting. It's like they're both builders, and what would you say they're building? What's the commonality of what they're building? What is Yosef? They're
building something that is based on things that belong to other people, meaning they're collecting from others and then creating something. It's a creation yesh miyesh as opposed to yesh mi'ayin, which is
sure. They're definitely creating stuff that comes from others, and what they're doing deals with stuff that comes to others, right? The bar kachol hayam is. It's the food is not Yosef's food, right? It's a national thing, and similarly, all the stuff that's coming is from everybody in the nation. Okay, good. And what are they building? What's the commonality in what they're building?
They're building.
So Betzalel's building a Mishkan. What is Yosef building?
He's building up stores of food that will be able to serve them, meaning it's what's going to be their lifeline for the years when they don't have that the ability to create and to grow that food.
Lo ra'av lalachem v'lo tzama lamayim, right? Ki im lishmoa et divrei Hashem.
Yeah.
They're both building storehouses.
Mm-hmm.
The only question is, what are you storing? You're storing a lifeline. You're storing that which you need, something that comes from heaven, that I need to be able to survive here on earth.
So you're saying Yosef is building the physical stores, and Betzalel is creating a lifeline to God, essentially, creating this storehouse, a silo that can essentially be a meeting place with God. Yeah.
And the question then is, right, was Yosef supposed to be the first Betzalel? Think about how history should have turned out. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz mugurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. Yosef comes back to Canaan after his long sojourn in Lavan's house, right? And he's there to settle down. Where? Be'eretz mugurei aviv, where everybody else was just a ger, but I'm going to settle down. And if I interviewed you, Yosef, and you were Yaakov at that moment, and I said, so what do you think your life is about? You know, you went through some hard times with Esav, you were like in slavery in Lavan's house, but you're back, you're in Canaan now, right? God said, pray urvei goyu kahal goyim, right? Malachim. What do you think you're supposed to do with the rest of your life? What would you say?
Live out my life and create a family in Israel?
Yeah, and that family is going to become a nation. Mm-hmm. But what about the Bris Ben Absarim? What about this period of exile? So Rav Soloveitchik famously says that Yaakov probably thought it had happened already.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? That his time in Lavan's house was the Ger Yezarach Haberes Lola. Was the time that he was in slavery. I was a ger. I was in somebody else's house. Mm-hmm. I worked really hard. All right, it wasn't 400 years, but it was a long time, right? And I'm finally back, and my job is Vayeshev Yaakov. I'm just supposed to sit here. I'm supposed to have a family. I am going to be the Av that finally gets it done. Avram, he didn't really get it done. Yitzchak, he thought it, but me, this is it. After all, Dor Revi'i Yashuvahena, God said that the fourth generation was going to return here. Yeah. And that's what Soloveitchik says. Yaakov knows how to count. Avram is generation number 1. Yitzchak is generation number 2. Me, Yaakov, I'm generation number 3. And Yosef, the firstborn child from the wife I was always supposed to marry. Yosef, Vayihi kasher yalda Rachel at Yosef, the pasuk says, and when Rachel gave birth to Yosef, Vayomer Yaakov Lavan, Yaakov says to Lavan, Shalchini va'elchel makom yilartzi, let me go, it's time for me to go home, the fourth generation is here. This is how Rav Soloveitchik seems to read it. So he thought that it was all over. Now, if he was right, if he would have been right, who is Yosef? Yosef is this harbinger of the fourth generation. And here comes Yosef. And this promise to Avram is you're going to have children like the stars of the heaven, like the sands of the earth. And look at that language used for the bar, right? The bar kechol hayam. It's like Yosef is this maestro of this orchestra of things that are kechol hayam. And in another universe, in another world in which Mechirat Yosef never happens, then maybe Yaakov's right. And maybe they're in Israel. And if they're in Israel, where does that power of Yosef manifest itself? It manifests itself in Israel. And Yaakov, and there is no famine. And Yosef isn't bringing life-saving grain into the world, right? He's actually creating a space where the Shekhinah can be there to relate to the Chol Hayam of the people, right, which are going to be Israel and the land. And that was his destiny, right? But it didn't work out because he's in Egypt, but he still has that power. So he becomes the first Navon v'Chacham. And think about that language, Navon v'Chacham. Where do we get that in Dvarim? Right, that language comes back to what's our destiny as a people. Right? That Navon v'Chacham language is supposed to be what the nations say to us, the same way that Paro looked at Yosef and said, you blow me out of the water. You're so close to God and you're Navon v'Chacham. So when we do what's right, what are you supposed to do in Dvarim? What happens? People are going to look at you and they're going to say, Rak am Chacham v'Navon, Hagoy Hagadol Hazeh. Right? This is incredible, you guys. Ki mi goy gadol asher Elokim krovim elav. Just like Paro said, who are you that you have the Spirit of God within you? That's what the nations are going to say looking at us. They're going to say you got two things. You've got the Spirit of God in you, Elokim krovim elav, and you're Navon v'Chacham, and you have Chukim u'Mishpatim tzadikim. You have these laws, and you don't know how to execute them to build a society. So here is Yosef, and he's a smart guy who knows how to administrate and organize. He's got that practical side of him, that Navon v'Chacham, and plus he's got the Ruach Ruach Elokim Bo. He's got everything. Well, ultimately, that's what the nation is supposed to be, when they're in the land. We just went through a detour. And so Yosef has to...
And then instead, Yaakov became very sad and bitter as he describes himself. This fills in a lot of the contours, by the way. I mean, I thought it was understandable why he reports about his life that way to Paro. But this really adds a whole nother layer of maybe he really thought that I was, we were the next part of the story already, and now there's this detour that he didn't expect. It's a fascinating commentary of Soloveitchik.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. So Yosef and Betzalel is a fascinating window, I think. Yep.
I really appreciate that. I mean, I thought this was going to go in many interesting directions, and indeed it did. And I really appreciate it. I feel like this is a wonderful way to sort of meditate on how the Mishkan story connects many, many parts within it. And sometimes we get lost in the description of the details of the accoutrements, right, of the kelim of the Mishkan. Yep. But ultimately, it's not just a literary nicety that some of the way it's described or the way you can divide up the sections according to Chazal also are really reminiscent of the creation story, but that there are so many elements that go into the construction of the Mishkan that really manifest, as we've said, many of the elements that are sort of placed in the world, or that God births in the world in the creation story. So this was a really, really moving look at all of these elements. And I think that, we can only hope that we utilize these talents of ours that really exist in everyone for the better. And I think that even just going back to the name Betzalel, of remembering that when we're creating in the likeness of and in the shadow of God, that essentially, at least in its best form, we hope that our creations are like that. We could put in our best effort that they ultimately manifest that way. So I really, really appreciate this conversation and you coming out here and sharing your Torah and the really creative way that you think about all of these pieces. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Yosefa. It was a real joy, and we'll have to do it again sometime. So invite me back.
Amen. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.